With the Imperial Japanese Navy seen off for the moment after the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, aka the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Admiral Spruance could turn the fleet's attention back to helping the troops ashore on Saipan, which, fortunately, was actually progressing somewhat better than the earlier reports he'd been given had indicated. Those earlier reports had, of course, to a degree, dictated his course of action during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Ideally, the first thing he wanted to know was when Saipan would likely be secured so that he could schedule dates for the invasions of nearby Tinian and then Guam, the largest and most southerly of the 5 islands that make up the Greater Marianas. But although the advance was going better than had previously been reported, there was a degree of tension between the Marines, who were advancing up either flank on the island, and the Army's 27th Division, with the Marines alleging that the 27th had failed to support them and that as a result the whole offensive was stalling out. Although some Army officers agreed that the division's performance was below standard, Spruance had a potential intra-service bomb on his hands. Typically, if a flag or ranking officer was deemed to no longer be up to the job, they would be relieved by their service's immediate superior, or possibly someone even a grade above that. In this case, however, you had a Marine general asking a Navy admiral to fire an Army general in the middle of an ongoing and rather vicious campaign. It had the potential to scuttle practically any working relationship between the US Navy, the US Marine Corps, and the US Army. But if Spruance declined to do anything, then the US Navy's relationship with the US Marine Corps would be severely damaged instead, and both ground forces were needed to tackle the Pacific campaign. And on top of that, almost every senior officer involved in the discussion actually quite liked the 27th Division's commander on a personal level. In the end, though, there wasn't any other way out, with all senior officers agreeing that the 27th Division really wasn't performing to standard, and General Smith, who was in charge, was thus relieved of command. But although this mollified the US Marine Corps, to almost nobody's surprise, it turned out to be practically impossible to turn around the capabilities of a fighting division mid-battle when they'd already taken heavy casualties. And also predictably, it set off a chain of arguments that went on long after the whole of the Second World War was over, but interestingly enough, most of the subsequent acrimony was between the Army and the US Marine Corps, who the Army judged as responsible for the relief of General Smith, with Spruance himself rarely being brought up by either side, even though, as the senior officer in charge of the campaign, he'd been the one to actually do the relieving. Given the savage fighting on Saipan, it was decided to reinforce the troops who were originally scheduled to take part in the next 2 assaults, with Spruance taking frequent visits ashore to check on progress, causing both delight and consternation for the troops on the ground. On the one hand, he always showed up with 5 gallons of fresh cold ice cream for his hosts, which was welcome. But on the other, he insisted on walking around the battlefield in his khaki Navy uniform and wearing no helmet, which meant he was then given a Marine bodyguard unit who were told in no uncertain terms that they were not to let the Admiral too close to the front lines, as in his current state of dress he made a superb sniper target. Finally, after almost a month of constant fighting, the end was in sight in early July 1944. Around 32,000 Japanese defenders had faced 72,000 or so Marine and Army troops, and both sides had paid a heavy price. The invasion force had around 3,500 killed or missing and around 13,000 wounded, with just over 260 Navy personnel killed or wounded in the course of various support operations. The Japanese suffered over 90% casualties, almost all of them fatal, along with around 10,000 locals who were caught in the crossfire, with barely 1,700 defenders taken alive, many of whom turned out to be slave workers. There was sporadic resistance from small groups of holdouts, which would continue to the end of, and in some cases past the end of the war, but the major fighting was now done. But worse than the casualties, the only troops available to now attack Tinian were the very troops who were currently trying to catch their breath after having just taken Saipan. Spruance relayed a request from his subordinates for the entire 77th Division to be called in to augment the assault on Guam, which was the larger of the two assaults, which would mean that those assaults would be delayed until at least July the 25th, when the division could arrive. His reply from Hawaii was that part of the 77th Division would be there by the 15th, and so he should go with that. Spruance countered that if the recommendations of his infantry and amphibious commanders were to be overruled by people behind the front lines just to keep the paper schedule of the Joint Chiefs of Staff happy, then he wanted them to make that an order in writing, formally. After a bit of silence, he instead got word that additional troop transports had been found and were being made available for the entirety of the 77th Division, and that they'd all be there by the 21st, which was to be the new assault date. In the interim, Spruance took satisfaction in the confirmation that Admiral Nagumo, his erstwhile nemesis at Midway, had been among the casualties of the Japanese defense of Saipan. The US Navy was quietly totaling up their battle-ready roster in the background. As well as the thousands of tons of shells and bombs flung at the island, other units, in particular submarines, had faced a very active month as constant Japanese efforts to resupply Saipan had been made, with a great many of those transport ships falling victim to the now working torpedoes of the US Navy's underwater hunter cadre. Although Guam was to be hit on the 21st, Spruance only allowed the Tinian assault to be advanced by 1 day from his preferred schedule, so it would now take place on the 24th. This would give the troops involved about 2 weeks to recover from their ordeal in the Saipan assault. But first he had yet another dispute to resolve: where to land on Tinian. His main amphibious commanders disagreed. Admiral Turner wanted to hit the wide beaches on the southwest of the island. These offered the greatest frontage of assault and easy routes into the interior, playing to the strengths of the vast number of troops that the fleet had. But they were also the obvious targets and thus were heavily defended. Admiral Hill, on the other hand, preferred 2 small beaches found on the northwest of the island. These were unobstructed and fairly lightly defended, if at all, but they were very narrow, and there would need to be an awful lot of combat engineering done to clear a route into the interior. Spruance didn't want to risk another blow-up and have to directly overrule Turner, and so he managed a clever workaround. He called a conference and asked each officer which beach he would prefer to assault, starting with the most junior, so that the junior officers wouldn't be intimidated by what their seniors had said. Everybody voted for the 2 small beaches, until finally Spruance reached Turner, who was the senior-most officer present except for Spruance, and faced with a consensus of his subordinates, Turner indicated quietly that, yeah, he would also support that option. This neatly avoided anyone having to publicly backtrack on their position, as officially Spruance had just asked his amphibious command cadre for their opinion, and their opinion, when freely given, had been unanimous. Unfortunately, the next in the series of blow-ups wasn't avoidable. Turner, although having publicly saved face in the switching beaches scenario, was still seething from having his preferred option taken away, no matter how politely it had been done. And then Lieutenant General Richardson of the US Army showed up. He promptly took himself ashore on Saipan, marshalled the entire 27th Division, that's the underperforming one, and made a grand show of distributing medals, ostensibly in an effort to raise morale. As those in the army will no doubt have realised already, it was not considered appropriate for a general who did not have the 27th under his command to just show up, pull a division off duty in the middle of a combat zone, just for some ceremonies. Spruance managed to rein in the most obvious antagonised officer, General Holland Smith of the US Marine Corps, but before anyone could do much more than beg him not to do anything stupid, Turner summoned Richardson aboard the USS Rocky Mount, which was Turner's flagship, and then laid into him with all the vigour of a tired, frustrated, and above all volcanically angry sailor. Richardson had at least had enough sense not to get into an argument with Turner, which probably would have resulted in an actual fist fight, but instead he took himself off to the Indianapolis to complain to Spruance, who tried to salvage the situation by making light of the incident, but wouldn't go any further in disciplining Turner, as he privately agreed with him, but Spruance had been doing his level best up to this point to simply pretend that Richardson didn't exist. Faced with indifference, the Army general stalked off, but the Army-Navy relationship had taken a major hit. Turner, however, didn't stop there, sending an angry letter to Nimitz with Spruance's endorsement. Nimitz, however, elected to ignore it in favour of preserving what little cooperation and goodwill still remained. A visit from Admirals King and Nimitz would occur shortly thereafter, the purpose of which was to discuss where to go after Tinian and Guam had been taken. Spruance recommended Okinawa, but also mentioned that they would need to devise a way to transfer battleship shells and heavy bombs from supply ships to capital ships while they were at sea. Historically, these larger munitions had been restocked in anchorages behind the front lines, but if they were going to take Okinawa, they'd be flanked on either side by large numbers of Japanese air bases. To screen the landings, the US carriers would have to support the assault itself and run interference between Okinawa and the Japanese home islands to the north and the Sakishima Islands and Formosa to the west. Even with the ever-growing size of the US Navy, he simply couldn't afford to rotate his ships offline for days or even weeks for them to head back the hundreds of miles that would be needed to rearm and then to return. His ships would have to remain on station for weeks, possibly months, with return only possible once ships became too badly damaged in one way or another to continue. It was an issue that would take some months to devise a solution to. The Japanese garrison on Tinian, meanwhile, had watched their comrades just 3 miles away on Saipan get gradually ground down. Then they'd watched the Fifth Fleet slowly turn its might in their direction. To make things worse for them, some inventive pyromaniac had come up with a brand new incendiary weapon, using a standard air fuel drop tank, which was partially filled with the jelly-like napalm and partially filled with more still liquid gasoline, plus a contact detonator for good measure. The resulting munition, when dropped on hapless Japanese positions, created a gargantuan fireball, sucking the air out of an area about the size of an American football field, and then setting it all on fire. And then the burning napalm, now liquid, flowed out and down into trenches, foxholes, bunkers, and caves. Although strongly against causing unnecessary casualties to the native population and thus forbidding the new weapon's use on villages, Spruance was perfectly happy to use anything and everything at his disposal on the Japanese troops, since he was of the opinion that their conduct thus far had indicated they'd almost all die in combat anyway, and if that was a given, then anything that helped them along that route without putting his own men in too much danger was perfectly fine by him. The choice of the northwestern beaches on Tinian proved to be a wise one. The Japanese were completely wrong-footed, and when they tried to redeploy to counter the assault, they were met by a deluge of liquid fire from the new napalm bombs. It took just 8 days and less than 2,000 total casualties to wipe out the majority of the 9,000 Japanese defenders. Guam was tougher, though. There were up to 22,000 defenders there, and it took almost 3 weeks to get rid of them all, with, again, the predictable near 90% fatality rate on the part of the defenders. This time, though, US casualties were lower than they had been on Saipan, with just over 1,700 killed and around 6,000 wounded. As one of his last acts before being relieved and sent back to the continental United States, Captain Moore, Spruance's chief of staff, wanted to raise the US flag on Guam, as his father had actually been the one to raise it there the first time when the US had taken Guam from Spain in 1899. Spruance agreed that this was entirely appropriate, but unfortunately word of this decision didn't reach the Marines ashore before they'd hoisted the flag themselves. Moore's relief, Admiral Davis, arrived aboard the Indianapolis just before the ship headed back to Pearl Harbor. Spruance had been relieved by Admiral Halsey, and the Fifth Fleet would now be relabeled the Third Fleet. Halsey would take the fleet to the Philippines, while Spruance would be back ashore planning for the invasion of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. When Moore and Spruance parted ways in September 1944, Spruance concluded Moore's final fitness report under his command with a recommendation for the Distinguished Service Medal and a note that read, "I have twice recommended Captain Moore for promotion to Rear Admiral, and these recommendations are now repeated." Behind him, US Army Air Force B-29s were happily making use of the Marianas to begin their bombing campaign against the Japanese home islands. But when he arrived at Pearl Harbor, Spruance was told the plan had changed. After a period of leave, he was instead to begin planning to take Formosa, now known as Taiwan, instead of Okinawa. This was as a result of a disagreement among the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Admiral King wanted to avoid invading Japan itself. Instead, he reckoned that if they took Formosa, it would cut off Japan's seaborne supply routes to Southeast Asia, including rubber-rich Malaya and the oil resources of the Dutch East Indies, not to mention the large amounts of rice and other basic food items that the Japanese were importing. He wanted to follow this up by invading China, pressing the Japanese army forces there between the Communist and Nationalist Chinese armies, who were mostly further inland, and a US advance coming from the sea. Presumably, he wanted this offensive to continue around into Korea, with the overall objective being to simply blockade Japan and starve it out. In contrast, others, including Spruance, wanted to take Iwo Jima as an airbase from which large numbers of land-based aircraft could provide permanent cover for a fleet that was staging further towards Japan itself. That it was also a stepping stone for the bombing campaign and a potential location for fighter escorts for the B-29s was a big plus from the US Army Air Force's side of things, but less of a concern to the Navy. From there, Okinawa would sever all Japanese interior lines of communication except those going to and from Korea and China, as well as providing a base from which to control the East China Sea and thus hinder even those movements, and potentially act as a nearby build-up point for an invasion of Japan itself. Spruance, like King, didn't especially like the casualty estimates that would be involved in invading the home islands, but King's approach looked at kicking the Japanese out of their overseas resource areas directly, whereas Spruance's approach, although somewhat closer to the enemy coastline, would allow the Imperial Japanese Army to garrison all the resource centers they liked, because if the US controlled Okinawa, precious little would reach Japan anyway. Spruance hoped, and suspected, that the idea of going after Formosa would not long survive conferences scheduled for the tail end of 1944, and so, seeing planning for a scheme that he fundamentally didn't believe in to be pointless, he sent the planning staff home for leave in September. It was also at this stage that he was informed that the British were coming, except, unlike the last time that phrase had been uttered on American soil, this one was somewhat more welcome. Spruance was of the opinion that as long as the British Pacific Fleet largely dealt with its own logistics, having more firepower to throw at the Japanese couldn't hurt. Well, it would hurt the Japanese, but it wouldn't hurt anyone that he thought actually mattered. He was also proven right in his suspicions over the Formosa plan. He was summoned to a conference at the end of September where it was revealed that the US war machine did in fact have limits. With an ongoing campaign in the Philippines, plus MacArthur's ongoing attempts to become Lord of New Guinea, plus the war in Europe, there simply weren't enough troops available to also try and take an island as large as Formosa, let alone the coastal region of China. What they did have was enough men to capture the far smaller Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and that pretty much settled the issue bar the arguing. In the end, in a rare show of unity, it took the Army, the Air Force, and most of the Navy to unite against Admiral King, and with this alliance it was just about enough to overcome King's one-man holdout. Back at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Davis recognised the superb staff setup that Captain Moore left behind and therefore made almost no changes. As the planning staff gradually came back from leave, they could now start planning what Spruance had intended all along. First up was the problem of Iwo Jima, but although it made overall sense, the US Marine Corps was still nervous. The fundamental problem was actually the US's own success. At the start of the campaign, there were so many places that they could attack the Japanese, that the defences had been spread across half an ocean. Now, with precious few targets left, it wasn't exactly too difficult for the Japanese to heavily fortify their few remaining island holdings. In Iwo Jima's case, dominated by Mount Suribachi, it was rapidly being turned into a warren of bunkers and tunnels. Whereas previously, part of the planning had been to try and get ahead of Japanese defensive preparations, now the US Navy had been committed to helping MacArthur get back the Philippines, and that meant that the Japanese would have months to reinforce Iwo Jima, but there was precious little that could be done to stop them. As the initial pressure on the Philippines could be eased up, submarines attacked the supply ships heading for Iwo Jima, and flights of B-24s harassed the building efforts, but at the ranges they had to fly, they couldn't carry heavy enough munitions to seriously dent already completed bunker networks. Indeed, the airfield that was on Iwo Jima actually began trading raids with the B-29 base on Saipan. One simple solution put forward was a 10-day naval bombardment designed to level practically anything on the island that wasn't Mount Suribachi itself. But this was dismissed as the battleships wouldn't actually be able to carry 10 days' worth of ammunition. The heavy ordnance resupply experiment had yet to bear fruit, and the sheltered resupply points were so far from Iwo Jima that a ship that went off to reload wouldn't be back before the landings had actually begun. Additionally, nearly 2 weeks of attack would signpost to the Japanese what the next target was, and give them time to try and reorganize reinforcements and/or potentially a counterattack. The US Marine Corps at minimum wanted 4 days of bombardment, but Spruance eventually came back with an offer of 3. He explained his reasoning. There were thousands of Japanese aircraft in the home islands. These needed to be suppressed, but if the bombardment started before the carrier strikes, then the Japanese would know that the fleet was coming for them, and they could either launch a mass attack on the fleet or hide all their aircraft in preparation to attack the transport ships once the landing began. But if the bombardment of Iwo Jima and the airstrikes on the home islands started at the same time, he could only guarantee 2 continuous days of airstrikes, possibly 3, before either weather conditions changing or the need to resupply would force the carriers to break off. A 4-day bombardment, with potentially only 2 days of airstrikes on the airfields, would give the Japanese 2 days to recover and then hit the landings as the landings went in. 3 days would mean, in the worst case, the home island airfields would still be recovering when the landings began, and in the best case, they'd still be on fire, as the carriers would have hit them in the previous evening and then dashed over to Iwo Jima overnight to support the landings in the morning. It also meant that the battleships, cruisers, and destroyers involved would have some ammunition left for more pinpoint strikes that could then be called in by the troops once they hit the beaches. As the Philippines campaign dragged on, the assault dates for Iwo Jima and Okinawa were gradually pushed back into late February and early April 1945, respectively. Spruance considered taking the whole fleet in for a surprise raid off the Japanese coast, as and when he got back in command, since the B-29s, which were flying very high to avoid Japanese anti-aircraft fire, were finding it hard to hit the Japanese aircraft factories, which were often covered by intervening low and mid-level clouds, and Spruance considered that low-level mass strikes of Avengers and Helldivers might have better luck at disrupting aircraft production. In the meantime, the bulk of the Imperial Japanese Navy threw itself, to spectacularly little effect, at the US Navy in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which at least removed a chunk of their surface attack forces from the equation going forward. Spruance headed back to the front lines in January 1945, arriving at Ulithi on the 25th, and with the arrival that afternoon of USS New Jersey, the process of 3rd Fleet becoming 5th Fleet again could begin. As January turned into February, a new flag was seen on ships entering Ulithi, as the 4th Cruiser Squadron of the Royal Navy had arrived as the vanguard of the British Pacific Fleet. The squadron was a small addition to the juggernaut that 5th Fleet had become, Between soldiers, marines and sailors, there were near enough 250,000 men under Spruance's command, so many in fact that no less than 36 admirals of various flavours, including himself and Davis, were needed to oversee it all. But not everything represented as many resources as he wanted. The bombardment forces had been centred around 7 older battleships from 7th Fleet, but between combat damage and ongoing efforts in the Philippines, only 2 of the more recent of these ships, the Idaho and the Tennessee, were available. Although the total bombardment force was brought up to a total of 6 by drafting in the Nevada, Texas, New York and Arkansas, although powerful in their own right, the 12-inch and 14-inch guns on these ships were viewed by the Marines as lesser substitutes for the 16-inch guns of the West Virginia, Colorado and Maryland, which they'd hoped might otherwise have been to hand. Admiral Turner tried to purloin USS Washington and North Carolina from Task Force 38, but Spruance countermanded the order on the grounds that the fast battleships carried minimal high-explosive shell loadouts, and they were far more useful defending the carriers with their heavy anti-aircraft batteries. But he did promise to release the 2 ships, and any other battleships he could spare, to bombardment duty on the day of the landings once the carriers returned from their expeditions. On the 11th of February, the invasion fleet arrived off Saipan, the staging point, while Task Force 58 made speed for the Japanese home islands. Ahead of them ranged submarines, destroyers, and US Army Air Force bombers, all to blast a hole through any Japanese picket lines so that the incoming carrier strikes would not be expected. The 13th and the 14th were spent topping off everybody's fuel tanks, but at the last moment the weather closed in, with even snow covering the fleet's decks. At dawn on the 16th, rain, sleet, and a low-level overcast was the order of the day, but if you wanted to see a bright spot in all of this between the total emissions control and the bad weather, the fleet had managed to get to less than 125 miles from Tokyo completely undetected. Unfortunately, the low cloud cover covered all the aircraft factories of southern Tokyo, so they remained mostly undamaged, but a number of airfields in northern Tokyo were hit instead, apparently accounting for several hundred enemy aircraft on the ground. Taking a bit of a risk, a second morning of strikes were launched, but then operations had to be curtailed. Although the weather over land had improved, making it possible to hit some of the aircraft factories, the conditions at sea were getting worse, which would be a perfect setup for the now alerted Japanese defences to hit the fleet. Spruance and Mitscher decided that they'd be back, but for the moment 2 carrier task groups and the battleships would be making best speed for Iwo Jima, while the other carriers went after Japanese bases on nearby islands. Back on Iwo Jima, initial surveys seemed to indicate that the beaches were relatively clear of obstacles, but the bombardment seemed to be having relatively little effect on more substantial prepared defences further in. It had been thought, though, that the bunkers and emplacements that had been right on the beaches had suffered enough so the landings could proceed. The first of 70,000 troops headed in, but it was to prove far more costly than expected. The volcanic sand and ash bogged down vehicles and, as it turned out, had absorbed much of the bombardment's blast effects. But when the first boots hit the sand, there was surprisingly little enemy fire. After spending an hour in these weirdly calm conditions gathering their forces on the beaches, the US troops suddenly found themselves under a hail of fire as Japanese positions opened up. About their only comfort was that at least the incoming Japanese artillery was likewise muffled in its effects by the beach sand, which afforded scant other cover from the incoming fire. Spruance did his best with many of the fleet's ships put on call for shore bombardment and the carriers flying strikes off as fast as humanly possible, but ultimately Iwo Jima was near perfect defensive terrain and the Japanese were making full use of it. He also had to bear in mind that the Joint Chiefs of Staff expected him to hit Okinawa in 6 weeks' time, and already ships were having to be sent back, either due to combat damage, collision damage, running aground, or in the case of the battleship New York, one of its propeller blades falling off. He was, however, slightly amused by Japanese radio broadcasts, which were specifically calling for the death of Admiral Turner for his part in the invasion, but completely failing to call for Spruance's own execution. After 5 long days of fighting, the US flag was hoisted atop Mount Suribachi, but the battle for the island was far from done. Task Force 58 mostly headed back to Japan to try and hit airfields and factories once again, but once more poor weather thwarted most of their efforts. This time, to wipe out most of the 21,000 or so defenders, it would cost the US around 7,000 killed and over 19,000 wounded, plus another 2,500 or so who were invalided home for what we would today call PTSD, but back then was more commonly known as shell shock. It was a heavy price, but not likely one that more bombardment would have solved, albeit the debate as to how much more bombardment could have solved the issue goes on to this day. Spruance and the Indianapolis were forced to head back to Ulithi in early March to begin preparing for the invasion of Okinawa, even while the fighting on Iwo Jima had several weeks to run, before all that was left was hunting down the holdouts and preparing the airfields for the B-29s, who had decided to forego precision bombing of Japanese targets from 30,000 feet in favour of simply mass incendiary attacks burning entire cities to the ground, on the basis that if the factories were located within the cities, and you burned down the entire city, then you had also burned down the factory. With the focus now set on Okinawa, Spruance was left to consider the state of his fleet. A steady attrition caused by kamikazes, more regular air attacks, and a few operational issues was sapping the strength of his carrier groups faster than new ships could come out to replace them. In this context, the arrival of the British Pacific Fleet was a welcome one. He could position them on his left flank to deal with Sakishima entirely, and, as it would turn out, Formosa, whilst Task Force 58 could then be devoted to hitting Kyushu's airfields on his right flank as the invasion force, supported largely by escort carriers until the big ships could return, hit the beaches. Yet, even the best efforts of the 2 largest navies on the planet seemed to only dent the Japanese resources. Indeed, it would later turn out in post-war investigations that even as dozens and then hundreds of aircraft were destroyed on the ground, the Japanese actually had thousands more carefully hidden in secure facilities, including caves, which they would then bring out to replace them. Thus, while denying them the use of airfields would stifle the flow of airstrikes and kamikazes, the carrier's combat air patrol would have a busy time intercepting wave after wave of enemy fighters and bombers heading for either the landings or the carriers just as soon as the Japanese could patch up the holes in their airfields and get new aircraft out from their secure stores. As matters escalated in the last few days before the invasion, Spruance received a signal originating from all the way back home. Some not too bright spark had convinced themselves that Japan's remaining aircraft carriers, this is bearing in mind after the Battle of Cape Engano, would use the fact that US forces were concentrated off Okinawa to sail from their home bases in Japan, go all the way past Pearl Harbor, and attack the US west coast, and somehow magically regenerate fuel enough to then head home. And they wanted him to divert 2 entire carrier task groups and their support ships to intercept a hypothetical returning Imperial Japanese Navy strike force. Spruance read the signal and promptly filed it over the port side of the Indianapolis into the Pacific. As the date for the invasion drew closer and the tempo on both sides ramped up, even Indianapolis herself would be hit, but Okinawa remained worryingly quiet. Apart from occasional aircraft launching from what was left of the airfields, even the landings themselves went in with surprisingly little ground opposition. A few days later, and aside from a few skirmishes, still nothing much had happened. This, however, was in stark contrast to the air war above. With his flagship cruiser in need of dockyard attention, Spruance returned to the front lines aboard the USS New Mexico just in time for the worst kamikaze attack of the war, with around 400 suicide aircraft and 300 more conventional strike aircraft appearing on the 6th of April. 22 of these got through to land hits. Half a dozen ships were sunk, many others were damaged, and still more aircraft showed up the next day. Overnight, news came of a large Japanese ship being spotted heading for Okinawa. Follow-up reconnaissance revealed her to be the Yamato. At first, Spruance wanted the carriers to concentrate on keeping the kamikazes away, and thus for the battleships to deal with the Japanese giant. But then there was an unexpected lull in air attacks and worrying reports about Yamato's movements, which seemed to indicate she might be trying to evade or escape, and so he ordered in Mitch's aircraft, and the Japanese flagship was sent to the bottom in a series of massive air assaults. Fifth Fleet found itself quite embattled. The British Pacific Fleet was playing whack-a-mole with the airfields on the Sakishima Islands and northern Formosa to their west. Task Force 58 was hitting airfields on Kyushu whenever they could catch a break, and the US Army Air Force was even briefly roped in to try carpet bombing these targets as well, albeit that seemed to have fairly little effect. It was only thanks to the persistent efforts of naval aviators from the US Navy, US Marine Corps and Fleet Air Arm that the kamikaze and conventional strikes stayed just this side of bearable, despite dozens of ships being sunk and hundreds damaged. The land campaign had now also reached the Japanese main line of defence, and was grinding slowly to an apparent halt. Heroic efforts by the Seabees, who often could look up to see shells from the supporting battleships crossing right over their heads, managed to establish airfields on the occupied parts of Okinawa. Although these were repeatedly attacked, eventually these runways were able to sustain land-based fighters, which were able to take the pressure off the slowly dwindling supply of flight decks. On the 12th of May, 2 kamikazes flew in low out of the setting sun and headed for the New Mexico. Snap fire from the anti-aircraft guns sent one tumbling into the sea, but the other smashed into the ship just after the bridge in a spectacular fireball, causing over 150 casualties. Spruance was missing, and his staff dodged falling, burning debris and damage control parties to try and find him, or they feared what was left of him. Eventually, someone came across a damp and smoke-stained individual with far too many stars on his uniform. Spruance was manning a fire hose alongside other sailors. He'd been on his way to the bridge when the passageway in front of him had erupted into fire and smoke, and so concluding that he probably wasn't reaching the bridge anytime soon, he just grabbed a nearby hose, joined some nearby sailors, and gone to work. Somewhat improbably, the staff decided that the best way to deal with the constant stress of air attacks and shore bombardment at all hours was to start a poetry competition, and they roped in some of the regular ship's crew and the Royal Navy's liaison officer as well. On the 26th of May, the USS Missouri hove into view. Nimitz, detecting a hint of the exhaustion that Fifth Fleet was facing, had not only dispatched reinforcements, but these reinforcements also bore Halsey and his team to relieve Spruance and his staff. The now Third Fleet would see the finish of the Okinawa campaign, and on the 27th, with the unlikely backdrop of a mass kamikaze raid, Halsey formally took command and Spruance was able to head for Guam, the new forward base for the US Navy, as Pearl Harbor was now considered to be too distant. Here he was to meet Nimitz and would be ordered to start planning for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. But even as he stepped ashore on Guam on the 1st of June 1945, the atomic destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was just over a month away, obviously unknown to Spruance at the time, but his part on the war's front line was now over.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.